So welcome everyone. It's nice to see all of you here today. Today's session is titled The Three Pillars of Motivation and is in part based on some research I did with a colleague, Amy Fisk from SUNY Geneseo, on the experience our students with disabilities had during the initial move to remote learning in spring 2020. At both SUNY Geneseo and SUNY Oswego. And it's also some of the research that we did in the design and development of our 10-day accessibility challenge and more recently, the 5-day accessibility challenge. So although what I'll share today are not like specific quotes and things from students with disabilities, these are some of the trends that definitely emerged from the research that we did. The group's not real huge today, so if you have questions, feel free to pipe in. There is a lot of opportunity to brainstorm ways to apply this in our classes at the end. And I think I left ample time for people to kind of pipe in and converse as necessary. And given that there's not a huge group, I think we can do that all in the main session without needing to do breakouts. So self-determination theory, we're not going to go into deeply here, but it's a meta theory about motivation, and it describes kind of three categories: autonomy, right? This ability to kind of make your own choices and feel like you're empowered to do so. Feeling competence or competency, right? The ability to feel like you can achieve things and have success. And relatedness, which is really about kind of establishing and forming deep relationships. And these are things that can motivate folks in a wide variety of contexts. They're the things that certainly motivate my 4-year-old to do things or not, right? So autonomy taken away, then we don't want to do anything, right? Et cetera. So what I want to show you is that these three categories kind of nicely map to some other places where we're seeing information or research around motivation. So for example, if we think about the design of games, which is something that I've taught in the past, you might see some of these kinds of ideas. And these particular categories I pulled from Jane McGonigal's Reality is Broken book. So she talks about the idea of agency and impact. So feeling like as a player in a game that you have choices that you can make that have a direct impact, and you can kind of see what that impact is. It doesn't seem arbitrary. It seems like it's, got a purpose. There's the ability to kind of have fun failure, right? Like you can make, games are designed so that you make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and move forward in a really positive way. So there's the opportunity to earn points. You might be able to gain lives, all kinds of things here where, there's a lot of room to take risks and make mistakes, but still ultimately be successful. Sometimes you might hear this in the context of game design as like just enough challenge. So just enough that you feel like challenged and kind of motivated to achieve that, but like not so much challenge that it seems like it's out of reach. And then a third piece that McGonigal brings up is this idea of becoming a part of something bigger than ourselves, feeling like you're part of a big network, right? Feeling like the things that you're working on collaboratively are going to achieve some sort of end goal that is beyond something that's just personal or individual. And in the research that I did with Amy Fisk, students brought up these three categories really consistently in their responses to us. Essentially what we did is we interviewed through using a digital format, 39 students from Oswego and Geneseo, and asked them a number of open-ended questions. And these were things that they reported out or shared or had thoughts on. So one is that they really succeed or feel like they are nourished when they have flexibility and choice. Flexibility could mean a wide variety of things from, maybe faculty appreciating that they may have challenges during the pandemic, right? Like they might have digital technology challenges, they might have mental health challenges, et cetera. And maybe there's some flexibility around deadlines or extra support. Or the idea of choice, like, I get to pick what project or how I'm going to represent my knowledge that I've gained or the skills that I've developed over the course of this semester. The second category here is organization and structure. And this really applies to online learning systems like Blackboard, et cetera. The idea that things need to be really organized, highly structured, and like with plenty of guardrails in place so that students can continue to kind of have scaffolded support to succeed, right? And that when there's consistency in the LMS and things are very explicit, we're successful. None of this should seem like a big surprise, right? But students were able to articulate this for themselves without much prompting. And then the third thing that actually came up the most is this idea of needing to feel a sense of community and belonging. So they need to feel like they belong. That means for a student with disabilities, for example, that if they come with an accommodation letter, like they should get their accommodation, right? But many students actually were reporting they weren't getting accommodations, right? So that's a very like baseline level of feeling like you belong, is that if you are entitled to something like an accommodation, that you're actually getting it. It also came out in conversations around needing accessible content and making sure that the materials come with accessibility in mind so that they can be used in a wide variety of ways to review material, to put that material in different formats, et cetera. It also means feeling like their faculty member was reachable or available, right? That they could get the help and the support that they might need throughout this semester. And one of the things that was really interesting that also came up as a theme is that with a lot of reliance on digital and virtual technologies, there really needs to be intentionality around facilitating kind of the development of peer-to-peer relationships and community that maybe don't need to be as structured in a non-pandemic setting, right? Where, some faces might become familiar and you might approach a person that you're seeing on a regular basis to see if they might want to form a study group or something like that. So these three categories are really not that different from the self-determination categories of autonomy, competency, and relatedness. It just kind of, in a slightly different context, is coming out in a slightly different way, but they're really getting at some of these same ideas. We took advantage of these three categories, or these three pillars, as I'm kind of calling them, when we were designing the accessibility challenge. So if we think about that kind of like agency category, we provided things like multiple levels throughout the challenge and choices so that participants could choose different pathways to complete the 5-day or 10-day accessibility challenge to build their skills. And that the choices that people were making could be based on the things that they wanted to achieve, right? Their personal goals or the kind of work that they do, so that the things that they were engaging in were meaningful and didn't seem arbitrary or something that, in the context of a classroom, maybe students might call busy work. We also tried to provide, using the structure of the 10-day and 5-day challenge, a structure to guide through a wide variety of resources. If any of you have visited our campus accessibility website, you might realize that we have a plethora of options, many tutorials through many different pieces of software and things, but it can be really daunting if you're not familiar with the site, you're not familiar with the basics to kind of even know where to start. And so this provided that scaffolding and structure to help people move through that. The other important piece here is also thinking about removing assumptions of base knowledge and just starting from the beginning. Like, what is our common point that we're starting with? What's a common definition of accessibility? When we're talking about accessibility, what do we mean? And this could be applied in any learning context, whether it's for professional development, whether it's kind of in a student life space or in a classroom context. And then when we were, designing the 10-day accessibility challenge, we also took advantage of this like category of relatedness, or the being a part of something bigger than yourself, or this idea of needing to feel a sense of belonging by developing something that was a campus-wide activity. So it gave people a way to connect. It also gave them an opportunity, and has given many of you who are participants in the challenge who are here today, the opportunity to connect with experts on the campus through various workshops and the office hours. So we were trying to take advantage of these 3 pillars of motivation to get people to act in and make change in the same way that we can think about it in the classroom, right? So what I wanted to spend our time today, if you're interested, was to kind of look at each of these categories in a little bit more depth and consider the ways that we could employ these either in our classroom, in the offices that we work in, and the ways that we support students and our colleagues. So the first category here is autonomy or agency, this idea of flexibility and choice. Some of the things that I brainstormed and that I'm thinking about for my classes this spring are, options for assignment choice, right? Here are some skills you need to demonstrate to me, like you pick the project, right? Or here's the project parameters, you pick the topic, etc. Making sure that all of the materials that I'm providing students in my class are digitally accessible, so that they can use it in the way that makes the most sense for them. And maybe even considering not providing some of the resources if I know that they're not accessible, so that I can communicate that it's important that the things that we share with each other are accessible. We could also think about flexibility in terms of things like best by dates. So rather than here's a hard deadline, here is the best by deadline with some grace, like a grace period for a due date. We could also think about things like self-assessment or reflection as a way for students to kind of gain some control over the way that they are evaluated in a classroom, right? It is in line with some things like ungrading and that kind of thing. You'll see, for those of you that might be familiar with UDL, or the Universal Design for Learning, these three pillars of motivation don't like directly map to the 3 columns in UDL, but you can see pockets of it throughout UDL. So you can see things like recruiting interest and the idea of choice and autonomy, right? You can see things like promoting self-regulation, right? So there are ideas here that are tied to each of these categories that are kind of spattered throughout here, or the idea of, providing multiple forms for communication of learning. What are some things that you all are thinking about in your classroom context as you're planning for the spring? Or I see faces from other spaces on campus as well that interact with students in different ways. What are some ways that we can design the ways that we engage with our students so that they allow or support autonomy, agency, and flexibility? You're welcome to use the chat or to unmute.
I can jump in, Rebecca.
Thanks.
So I have thought about, I have a presentation component in my class, and so I want them to be able to have a choice as far as the assignment, whether it's presenting in person to their peers or doing a recorded presentation. The nature of my class also allows for, I'm trying to have them do a little bit more of a service learning component. So maybe their presentation could be at Quest or something like that. And I want to try to tie it back into, like, yes, I have core objectives for the course, but hopefully they set their own additional goals of professional development that they want to build. But I also like your, the idea of just even a more simple assignment, like a participation-based assignment to demonstrate that they've done a reading. give them the option of either writing a summary or using the hypothesis annotation, something like diversity in that option, I think would be good for them too. So I like that approach of not only like a bigger scale assignment choice, but even for those smaller weekly assignments, especially if it is just like the A for effort kind of assignments, give the students the ability to use a tool that would be most beneficial for them.
Or if it's a class maybe where there's a lot of, if it's an upper level class and that you could go in many directions, right?
Exactly.
And still meet the course objectives. Maybe the students have a choice either collectively or individually about things to kind of deeply study or dive into, or choose readings or something. How about some other thoughts? Anyone else want to chime in? Thanks, Emily. So if we move into the second kind of pillar of competency, fun failure, organization structure, the idea of having significant guardrails so that people can be successful. We could think about ways that we could scaffold assignments. In those assignments or bigger projects, maybe we have particular milestones where we provide feedback to students and allow for revision. There's some faculty that use things like OOPS tokens. So they could be, submitted to get an extension or to get a revision or something like that. You could consider things like low or no stakes assignments. And that's something that I'm definitely experimenting with. I had a lot of low stakes assignments in the past, and I'm moving to having maybe a shift to a little more balance of no stakes assignments to allow for experimentation and taking risks within the class period so that students can really level up in some spaces where they've been tentative because they're in fear of a grade. Building in lots of opportunities for revision often also really support this idea of organization, structure, and helping students feel like they're competent. We also can think about multiple pathways to success, right? So maybe it's one larger project that they work on iteratively, or maybe they have a challenge to do smaller projects that demonstrate things in smaller chunks if that seems more manageable to students. I know that this is something that I've thought about a lot in relationship to kind of the significant mental stresses that students are kind of facing and that they've talked about in my classes in the last semester in particular, that, for some students, having many smaller assignments like provided a lot of structure for them and it was really helpful. And then for other students, it was like too much to keep track of and they prefer to work on one thing consistently and just keep building and then, revising it based on new skill sets that they have. So providing pathways that might support students who in this moment in time would prefer one over another based on other stressors or responsibilities in their life might be something to think about. Another thing to consider is something like calibrating the challenge, like thinking about, is the same challenge or the same exact assignment useful for all students if they come in with really different backgrounds or experiences? And this will depend on like what kind of subject you're teaching and who the students are in the class. But for example, I teach classes where I typically have students that come from multiple majors. And so maybe have really different skill sets and they might need to or want to level up in different areas, but maybe start off at a higher level in some areas and a lower level in other areas, and needing to be able to calibrate that challenge so that they can kind of level up the things that they're struggling with the most and not just feel like it's impossible. And then another thing that comes up frequently and came up frequently in the research that I was doing with Amy Fisk is that students were like really, really, really wanting consistency in like the widest way of understanding the word. So consistency in terms of what to expect in like class periods or within a week, consistency in terms of deadlines, consistency in terms of where things are located on Blackboard or their learning management system. But having something that's consistent that they can always go back to is something that they indicated was really helpful to them. What are the ways that some of you are thinking about organization, structure, and helping folks feel competent in the work that you do? And I know we're all coming from really different backgrounds. Some of us are in the classroom, some of us are providing support services for students and for our colleagues. Any questions about this idea?
Rebecca, I'll share. This is Grace. So in the work as an advisor, I would say the OOPS tokens and just kind of being present no matter what they brought to the table or didn't bring to the table. I call it unconditional advising, it's like that unconditional love, especially for EOP, because we're with our students from the summer before they start until they graduate and beyond. So that unconditional piece is really important, that they can mess up, they can have a bad semester, they could blow us off for a semester. We're still here and we don't hold that against them. Makes a difference, I think, in them feeling like that belonging piece in the beginning, that somebody's, going to be there for them, regardless of things that they've done. Because we've all been college students before, right? Many of us, I shouldn't say all. And we've been there where we've missed appointments and slept in or, didn't do what we needed to do the first time around. So the consistency piece is important in my classes. So I teach EDU 114 on the side, and everything is due at the same time this week. And I'm very kind of maybe strict, but I only open up what is due on Blackboard. There are no other links available. Nothing else is available, only the link that they need. And when it's due, it's closed and that's it. And although it seems strict in the beginning, the students, I think, really get a hold of it quickly and they realize that I'm doing it for a reason. I make them, it's not due at midnight, it's due at 10. And I tell them that I go and I check to make sure that everything is in at 10. And they will always complain and say, well, it's usually due at midnight. I'm like, well, I don't want you up until midnight doing my work, because I know you would be. So I'm going to have it due at 10. And, I think after like the first or second assignment, they're like, wow, nobody's ever thought of it that way. Like, thank you. I can get other things done by midnight, which is fine. But, so I guess the consistency thing has been proven, even though it's hard at first, to stay strict to it. It does help in the long run, because then they're all kind of in the flow for the class and they like that flow. At least that's what they've shared. And then the unconditional piece has been important too.
Thanks for sharing both of those examples, Grace. I really like the idea of this like unconditional support, right? Although we all know it can be really frustrating when students don't come prepared for something, right? Or don't have what they need. Not holding a mistake against them and having it define who they are as a person can be really important, right? And I think that's some of what you were underscoring, Grace. That consistency piece, right, about knowing what to expect, right, really clear expectations is certainly something that comes up consistently in inclusive pedagogy, right? But also providing this flexibility of, although it's very rigid, the structure is rigid, there are opportunities to make mistakes and recover, right? And those can come in different forms, right? They can come in the form of things like OOPS tokens, but can also come in the form of low stakes assignments where maybe lowest grades are dropped or things like this. Kristen put in the chat the idea of positive feedback, and that's really important, right? It seems particularly important when we're having a lot of students report mental health concerns, right? In encouraging them and finding ways to highlight what they're doing quite well, right? And not always focus on places to improve. Many of us who are in higher ed may kind of subscribe to the idea of continual improvement and may have a tendency to kind of think about like, oh, how am I going to do the next thing better? But not everybody approaches things like this. And I know it's something that I struggle with personally, is that, I have a tendency to kind of look forward, but wanting to revise what I did in the past. So I always highlight like the things that I want to revise. and am not always great at always making sure that I applaud or highlight, the things that have been done really well. And I've been making more of an effort to do that. So I love that, Kristen, that you underscored that as well. Kristen also put in the chat, I like the idea of OOPS tokens as a way to offer flexibility that is consistent across all students without having to make exceptions that could cause resentment among other students. Yeah, it's a nice way that no questions asked. You don't need to know any details about anyone's circumstances, and kind of highly respects people's privacy, which sometimes can be really valuable as well. And in support of this idea of community and belonging, right? And not having to disclose things that you don't really want to disclose. So things that we can think about when we're considering community and belonging are real world projects where students can see the impact of what they're doing. Maybe they work on these together with collaborators. Consider designing the opportunities for one-on-one meetings with students, particularly in smaller classes. Obviously, this doesn't scale up to John's 400-person class, right, very easily, but in smaller classes, it's something that we can often do and gives the opportunity to get to know students more individually, and can help students really feel like they belong. You can do things at the beginning of class that are no stakes. These are things that I often call warm-up activities that help transition into the classroom and transition into the learning space, which can help people start to feel present in what they're doing, and also can be a great way for them to connect. So it doesn't always have to be course related. It can just be a way of connecting students with each other. Simply using people's names and pronouncing their names correctly can be really helpful in establishing community and belonging. And I can't remember if the session already happened. I know there's one on the schedule for breakouts on learning names and strategies to learn those names if you need some tips on that. You can also think about, again, these kind of multiple ways of interacting with one another. So the opportunity to participate using things like chat, using breakout rooms, using small groups, using shared documents, so that you're really offering the opportunity for students to participate and connect with one another in multiple modalities and ways that don't necessarily preference maybe extroverts over introverts or other kinds of personalities. Another thing that you could consider are things like persistent teams. This is something that I've experimented a bit with in my classes that have a lot of technical things. And so there's a lot of, challenges that students might face as they're learning programming techniques and things. And so having a persistent group that they can rely on and establish community with, students have reported, has been really helpful to them. Previously, I did things like collaborative assignments where those persistent teams may be also working together on something. I'm stepping away from that in this next semester a little bit, maintaining the teams and doing some stuff together in class to support bigger projects, but not relying on one another for things for grades. After the reports I got from students last semester, just about kind of everyone's mental space and just ability to kind of function, nobody really wanted to have the extra pressure of needing to have to be dependent upon by other people. What are some other ways that you have explored establishing a sense of community or belonging for your students, or are kind of considering for this upcoming semester? And this can be within larger communities. We can think about EOP as a community. We can think about graduate students as a community. There's lots of different ways that we could consider kind of establishing this sense of belonging at different scopes and in and out of the classroom.
For EOP, we're definitely stepping up our socials again after being online for so long. We tried to do it online as much as we could, but we're going to be trying to do some safe ways of getting together this semester in different capacities, both academic and just social in nature. But one of the things we're doing is we're bringing for bringing offices to us, kind of like that one-stop shop idea from a couple semesters ago with the Dean of Students office. So we'll have financial aid in our office one day a week, possibly student accounts. The counseling center will be here one day a week. So there's a drop-in time where students don't have to go find them somewhere else on campus. They can just come to EOP's home base and get what they need. So it's one way that we're trying to kind of bring it to them, and also kind of foster that community, knowing that EOP is a place you can go to get that information.
Yeah, we'll look forward to hearing how that goes, Grace. Sounds like a good experiment. Any other offices or faculty thinking about different ways of building belonging or community in their classes? Well, hopefully the ideas that I shared here, which are, just in bullet form, but kind of giving some broad strokes of things to think about, might give you a way to kind of think about making sure you've got 3 pillars in place to motivate people to be successful, both in the classroom and in other spaces. So those, again, are kind of this idea of flexibility and choice, organization, structure, scaffolding, guardrails, and this idea of really making sure that we can develop and nurture a sense of belonging and community. Thanks. For those of you that are interested, I'll put the slide deck link in the chat. I'll just make sure we actually have access to it.